Hello, my name is Andrea, and this is Starlight Stories for Magical Children. Here you will find a collection of stories that were told to me from storytellers from magical realms, the animal kingdom, and nature. I am delighted to share these stories with you. And maybe as you listen, you'll find that life really is magical, and so are you. Our storyteller today is an instrument maker who also happens to be a fairy. He specializes in making magical instruments. He mostly uses this for his own kind, but sometimes his magical instruments end up in the hands of humans. And this is his story. Let's begin. Once there was a child named Miles. Miles had been awake since the very early hours of the morning. He had hustled over to his grandpa's house to help split wood for his grandpa's wood-burning stove. It was nearing the end of winter, and the wood pile was dwindling, and his grandpa needed some help. So after Miles finished chopping the last log, he popped into his grandpa's house, gave him a quick hug, grabbed his backpack, and said goodbye. Miles lived out in the country, and to get home, he just had to follow the creek south for about a mile. He was hurrying home, moving swiftly over the ground. He was nearing his house. All he had to do was cross the creek to get into his yard. But in his rush, he forgot to slow down. When his foot hit the frozen creek, he slipped, and he tried to catch his balance, but he found himself falling backwards, and he landed right on his backpack, hard. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," he said, quickly opening his backpack. He reached down into his bag, and he pulled out his flute. He could see the dents, and his heart sank. Miles loved playing his flute. Several years ago, he had decided that was the instrument he had wanted to play. So he had worked very hard saving up his money until he finally had enough to buy his own flute. And since then, he played it nearly every day. And as he grew in skill, he even began writing his own melodies. And that morning, he had brought his flute over to his grandpa's house to play him a few songs he had written. His grandpa loved to hear him play. But now, there his flute was, lying in his hands, dented. It would take nearly a year of working and saving his money until he could afford to buy a new one. He couldn't imagine going even a day without playing, much less a year. Miles started to cry. As he was kneeling on the ground holding his flute, he heard a soft voice say, "Why are you crying?" He looked up with tears in his eyes, and there, right in front of him, was unmistakably a fairy. For Miles had no other word to describe who he was seeing. He wasn't a human. He certainly wasn't an animal. Miles had read stories about fairies in books, but he didn't know they actually existed. Stunned to find a fairy was talking to him, he momentarily was distracted from the fact that his flute was broken. But then the fairy asked him again, "Why are you crying?" Miles was then brought right back to reality, and he replied, "My flute is dented and I won't be able to play again until I save enough money for a new one." Now, Miles had figured out he was talking to a fairy, but what he didn't know is that this fairy also happened to be an instrument maker. And this fairy, he had a soft spot for the child and his troubles. So after pausing for a moment, he said, "Wait right here. I'll be right back." The fairy disappeared, but a few moments later, he returned. He said to Miles, "My dear boy, when you get home today, you will find a brand new flute waiting for you on your bed. I have made it especially for you. But here is what you need to know about this flute. It was crafted in the land of fairies, and it was made with materials from the land of fairies. This means that this flute is not an ordinary flute. It is enchanted. It will be up to you, though, to figure out what the flute's magic is. Think of it as an experiment. And once you know the flute's magic, you will be able to control it, turning it on and off at will. But until you know for sure, you will just have to watch and see how the flute's magic shows itself. Do you understand?" Miles repeated back to the fairy what he had heard. "Okay, so there's a brand new flute on my bed, but it's enchanted? But the flute will have to show me what its magic is, and once I know, I'll be able to control it. Is that right? But wait, how do I control it?" "Ah, wise question," the fairy replied. "Here, let me give you an example. Say that every time you play your flute, a bowl of mashed potatoes shows up on your kitchen table. If you didn't want a bowl of mashed potatoes, you would just say, 'No magic mashed potatoes,' before you play. And then you could play your flute, and all you would get is music. Not music with a side of mashed potatoes," the fairy grinned. "Wait a second," Miles said. "Is that a possibility? I mean, the mashed potatoes part? I could eat mashed potatoes every day. Can I request that kind of magic?" The fairy laughed. "Yes, I suppose anything is possible, but no special requests. But you can trust that the magic will always be something that is useful, kind, or helpful. Now, go home and find it." Miles thanked the fairy and then ran home as fast as he could. He burst inside his door, ran up the stairs to his bedroom, and when he opened his door, he looked on his bed. And sure enough, just as the fairy had said, there was a brand new flute. He walked over, he clicked open the case, and looked inside. And oh, it was so beautiful. At first glance, it looked just like his old flute. But when he looked closer, he could see the most lovely, tiny, and intricate carvings of different symbols. He did not know what they meant. He had never seen such symbols before. But he was sure they were put there by the fairy. He picked it up, and his fingers naturally and easily found their ways to the proper keys. He noticed his heartbeat quicken as he wanted to play, but he also felt a little bit nervous to see what the magic would be. He reminded himself that the fairy did say the magic would always be useful, kind, or helpful, so he trusted that no matter what, it would be safe to play his flute. Miles began to play, wondering if the magic would somehow help him create even more beautiful songs. But he found himself playing just one of his regular melodies. The tone was clear, but nothing unusual there. He began to look around his room, seeing if his furniture was moving around or something unusual was happening, but everything looked the same. He thought to himself, maybe it's not actually magical. He brought his flute downstairs, and he found his mom in the kitchen. She was making bread, and she had just turned the dough out onto the kitchen table. She looked up at him and said, "Oh, hi, Miles. I was wondering if you would play your flute for me while I knead the dough. I find it so soothing, and I feel like your music makes the bread taste better." She winked at him. Miles said, "Oh, of course, Mom, I'd love to play for you." So he began to play. But Miles was so focused on his new melody that he forgot to look for any magical effects. He was halfway through his song when he glanced over at his mom, and he saw that she had fallen asleep in the dough right there at the table. Her cheek was resting on the ball of dough just like it was a pillow. He stopped playing, and his mom yawned, blinked open her eyes, and let out a little squeal. She tried to lift her face off the dough, but it was stuck to her cheek, and the more she pulled, the more the dough just stretched further and further, keeping her stuck to the table. "Oh no, Mom, let me help you." Miles put down his flute and helped to peel the dough off of his mom's cheek, and unfortunately also out of her hair. His mom was a little flustered, trying to clean the sticky dough off her face and her hair, her clothes, and also clean up the table. "Oh, I'm not sure what happened there, but I think I'll have to scratch this loaf and start again. And wow, Miles, that melody was so beautiful. Will you play that for me again sometime?" "Of course I will, Mom. But sorry about your bread dough." Miles began to wonder if there was a bit of magic responsible for this, but he would need to do some more experimenting to find out. Miles decided to take his flute outside. His dog came over and greeted him with a wagging tail, and then Miles looked around his yard, searching for his next audience he could play for. Ah, the chicken coop. The hens were walking around, pecking at corn and chicken feed. He knew it was about time to let them out of their coops so they could roam around the yard, so he opened up the gate and watched as the hens clucked and pecked their way out of the coop and ventured out into the yard. "Okay, let's experiment here." He began to play a song on his flute, but this time he watched carefully to see what would happen. The chickens' typical jerky movements began to slow down, and then they stopped moving completely and fell down to the ground, fast asleep. But not only the chickens, but his dog was asleep too, and the squirrels that had been chasing each other around the maple tree, also asleep. He stopped playing his flute, and soon after, the chickens, his dog, and the squirrels were all awake, moving around the yard. Okay, at this point, Miles was pretty convinced that his enchanted flute was a magical sleeping flute. But he wanted to do one more experiment, just to be sure. He went back inside his house to find his dad. As Miles walked in the house, he saw that his dad was just getting ready to go outside. He was sitting on his bench, and all of his winter gear piled up next to him. Miles began to play his flute as his dad was putting on his warm woolen socks and boots. His dad got one sock on, and then the other, but then Miles noticed his dad's movements began to slow, and Miles watched as his dad clutched his boot as tightly as a stuffed animal and slowly slumped over, fast asleep. Miles did giggle at the sight of his dad cuddled up with his boot. He was now certain that this flute helped others fall asleep. He stopped playing and watched as his dad woke up, a little confused and disoriented, trying to figure out why he was holding his boot to his chest. Miles knew he had to fill his parents in on his enchanted flute. His mom had just started her second attempt at her bread when he called his parents over. He excitedly shared the story about how he dented his flute and meeting the fairy, and then learning that his new flute helped others fall asleep. Once his parents heard the story, they felt so relieved to know the reason behind their unexpected naps. And then they were able to share something that they hadn't quite understood at the time. Both his mom and his dad shared that after they had woken up, they had felt so refreshed and energized, like they had just taken the best nap ever. And that was truly the moment that Miles understood the magic of his flute. The flute not only helped people sleep, but gave them a healing sleep, one that would help fully restore their energy. and now he knew he could control it. And he knew that would be very important to use his magic wisely and with caution. For a moment, he began imagining himself playing as part of an orchestra, but realizing he had forgotten to say the magic words as he watched the conductor fall asleep and tumble off the podium. He asked his parents if he could try to play while controlling the magic, and so they positioned themselves cozily on the couch, in case Miles couldn't quite control it yet. And before Miles began to play, he said under his breath, "No magic sleep." And then he played his song for his parents. And they stayed awake for the whole thing. After the song, Miles' mom said to him, "You know what, honey? Grandpa's been having a hard time sleeping at night. I'm wondering if you might be able to go play for him later today. I really bet he could use some rest." Miles loved this idea, knowing already that there was someone he could help with this new magic. So, later that afternoon, Miles was getting ready to head over to his grandpa's house with his flute. He did remember to put his flute in his case this time, but he also grabbed a few other things to put in his backpack. And then he headed over. As he was making his way, he got to the frozen creek, to the place where he fell and met the fairy. And here, he decided to leave a little gift of thanks for the fairy. He left a small piece of freshly baked bread, a thimble of honey, and a smooth pebble he had found in the creek last summer. And then he whispered a poem of thanks under his breath. "Mr. Fairy, your magic you have shared with me to make a flute that helps people sleep. I'll use it with thoughtfulness and care. Thank you, dear fairy, for being there." And then Miles continued the long walk to his grandpa's house, not only with a new flute, but also with a newfound sense of magic. The